My mom was dying right in front of me. The ambulance was only seconds away, but the HOA president next door was blocking the driveway, and she knew exactly what she was doing. What started as a quiet night turned into my worst nightmare. One moment I was boiling pasta for dinner. The next I was holding my mother as she gasped for air, while a clipboard-happy HOA president stood between her and the ER. You might think something like this could never happen in your neighborhood. But what if I told you? It happened because I brought my mom home after back surgery. No parties, no noise complaints, no rule breaking. Just a daughter trying to help her mother heal. And still, that wasn't good enough for the woman in charge of our HOA. This is the story of how Deborah Williams, the self-appointed sheriff of Pinecrest Estates, turned my driveway into a battleground. A story of how bureaucratic power can become a weapon. A story of silence, of neighbors too afraid to speak, and the one thing she never saw coming: who my mother truly was. In the next 30 minutes you'll see how HOA rules were twisted to punish someone for being sick, what happened when an ambulance was blocked on purpose, and how one gold badge changed everything. But before we get there, let me take you back to where it all began. It was 3 weeks ago. I had just picked up my mom from the hospital. She was weak, recovering from surgery, and just needed a place to rest. I thought I was doing the right thing. I had no idea it would nearly get her killed. When we first moved to Pinecrest Estates, Deborah Williams was one of the first people to introduce herself. She walked across her manicured lawn in a beige pantsuit, yes, a pantsuit at 7:30 a.m., with a binder tucked under one arm and a measuring tape dangling from the other. "Hi there," she chirped, flashing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I'm the HOA president. Just wanted to welcome you to the community and remind you about trash bin visibility standards." I remember blinking in confusion. My moving truck hadn't even finished unloading. That was my first lesson about Deborah. She didn't run the HOA. She was the HOA. At first I thought I was overreacting. I mean, sure, she was a bit intense, but every neighborhood has that one person, right? But over time, patterns emerged. Rules weren't just enforced, they were interpreted, twisted, and weaponized. If your lawn was 1 inch taller than regulation, fine. If your American flag was too faded, citation. If your child's playhouse was visible from the street, visual clutter, violation. Unless, of course, you were friends with Deborah. Her inner circle, 3 other board members and a few longtime residents, could paint their fences neon green and park boats on their driveways without a single complaint. But if you challenged her, you were next. Tom, my neighbor and the only sane person on the HOA board, told me over coffee once, "Deborah doesn't care about rules. She cares about control. The rules are just her favorite tools." And control she had. She once sent a formal HOA letter demanding that the Lopez family remove their unauthorized lawn art because their daughter had drawn chalk flowers on the sidewalk. They were 5. It was chalk. It rained 2 days later. But the $50 0-cent citation stuck. Another time she instructed maintenance to rip out Mr. Wilson's climbing roses, claiming they extended 2 inches past the fence line. Mr. Wilson was 82. The roses were older than some of the houses in the neighborhood. When he asked for a grace period to trim them, she replied, "I don't make exceptions, not for anyone. Unless, again, you were one of her people." That's when I stopped thinking of Deborah as a rule follower. She was something worse. A person who uses structure to hide cruelty. So when my mother moved in, I wasn't surprised that Deborah noticed immediately. I was surprised by how fast she mobilized. It took less than 24 hours for a violation notice to appear on my door. It took less than 12 hours after that for her to call a board meeting. And by the end of the week, she was walking the street again with her clipboard and camera, this time pointing at my windows. It didn't matter that my mom was recovering from surgery. It didn't matter that she was family or that the medical equipment wasn't even visible from the street. What mattered was that I didn't ask Deborah for permission. That's how she operated. Not through conversation, not through empathy, through warnings, citations, and public humiliation. There's a term I once read in a psychology book: authoritarian altruism. It's the idea that some people convince themselves they're protecting a community, while secretly feeding their need for dominance. That was Deborah in a nutshell. She believed she was preserving the beauty of the neighborhood, but all she was really preserving was her throne. And like all rulers drunk on power, she thought she was untouchable. Until the night she blocked the ambulance. Until she found out who my mother really was. But we'll get there. Because before that night there was still hope. Hope that I could reason with her. Hoped that I could explain, that logic and compassion would matter. So I tried. And what happened next? Well, it only made things worse. Let me take you to the moment I realized this wasn't just HOA enforcement. It was war. I always thought rules existed to protect us. Speed limits, building codes, safety inspections. They exist so people don't get hurt, so neighborhoods stay safe, organized, fair. But in Pinecrest Estates, I learned something terrifying. Rules can also be used to punish, especially when they're written in small print and held in the wrong hands. And Deborah Williams. She didn't just enforce the HOA bylaws. She twisted them into weapons. It started with a bright orange notice taped to my door. Violation unauthorized resident. Daily fine $100 0 cents until resolved. I stared at the paper in disbelief. My mom had been living with me for barely 36 hours. She wasn't renting. She wasn't subletting. She was recovering from surgery, for God's sake. She was still wearing a medical brace and could barely walk to the bathroom. I called Deborah immediately. Her response? Per Section 8, Paragraph 3, any individual staying more than 14 days constitutes a change in occupancy status and must be reviewed and approved by the HOA board. I blinked. It's been 2 days, Deborah. She didn't even pause. That's why I called for an emergency board meeting. Here's the thing about HOA bylaws. They're often written broadly and enforced selectively. Some sound reasonable at first glance. Maintain exterior appearance in harmony with community standards. Ensure all residents are registered and approved by the board. Prohibit commercial or medical equipment from public view. But none of those terms are clearly defined. What is in harmony? What counts as public view? And most importantly, who decides? In Pinecrest Estates, the answer was simple. Devereaux did. I did what any reasonable person would do. I called my friend Megan, a property lawyer. When I explained the situation, she laughed out loud. They trying to fine you because your mother is recovering from surgery at your home? That violates both state family care statutes and the federal ADA. She explained that, under most state laws, you're allowed to house a family member temporarily for medical recovery without HOA approval. And under the Americans with Disabilities Act, any attempt to penalize someone for using assistive medical equipment, even a walker or oxygen tank, is illegal. So technically, Deborah had no leg to stand on. But here's the catch. Most people don't know that. And Deborah knew it. She knew most homeowners didn't read the 94-page HOA handbook. She knew we didn't memorize every subsection and paragraph. She counted on that ignorance. Because fear is easier to enforce than fairness. This wasn't the first time she'd pulled this move either. Tom once told me about a couple down the street, the Tanners. Their adult son had Down syndrome. He stayed with them during the summers. Deborah filed 5 separate violations against them. One was for excessive presence of unregistered adult male. Another was for yard clutter, which turned out to be his wheelchair ramp. The Tanners moved out quietly 6 months later. No one questioned it at the time. But now I was starting to see the pattern. It wasn't about order. It wasn't about protecting property values. It was about control through confusion. That orange paper on my door wasn't just a warning. It was a declaration of war, disguised in legalese. And the more I pushed back, the more aggressive Deborah became. Security cameras showed up angled toward my front yard. Anonymous complaints were filed about noise from my mom's oxygen machine. Even my trash bin was cited for being left out 7 minutes past 9 a.m. It was absurd. It was calculated. And it was all technically within the rules. That's when I learned a painful lesson. Sometimes evil doesn't show up in a ski mac. It shows up in a pantsuit with a binder full of bylaws and a smile that says, "I'm just doing my job." But I wasn't about to let my mother's health, or our dignity, be erased by a technicality. So I did what Deborah never expected me to do. I fought back, legally. And as it turns out, not all rules are on her side. Because just a few days later she crossed a line that not even she could wiggle out of. It happened at 3:04 a.m. with my mom gasping for air, and the ambulance just seconds away. If there's one thing you never expect to argue about, it's whether or not your sick mother has the right to breathe. But when you live under an HOA ruled by people like Deborah Williams, even compassion becomes a violation. It was a Thursday evening. My mom had just finished her light physical therapy for the day, and I was cooking dinner. Spaghetti, her favorite. The house was quiet, except for the soft hum of her oxygen machine. Then I heard it. A sound that still wakes me up some nights. A sharp, gasping choke from the living room. I ran. There she was, slumped over, eyes wide, her hands clawing at her chest. Can't breathe. I grabbed my phone. Dialed 911 with shaking fingers. The dispatcher was calm. Too calm. "Ma'am, we have paramedics on the way, estimated time 6 minutes. Is she conscious?" "Yes, but barely." "Try to sit her up. Stay on the line. Help is coming." I propped her up with pillows. I held her hand, and those 6 minutes stretched out like a lifetime. But I heard them, sirens. They were close. Hope was coming. I sprinted out the front door to wave them in, only to stop dead in my tracks. My driveway was blocked. Parked sideways across the entrance was Deborah Williams' brand new black Escalade. Not a mistake. Not a coincidence. This was strategic. She had backed it in perfectly, cutting off the only clear path for a stretcher. I would find out later that she'd seen our lights come on through her personal security cameras and assumed I was sneaking in medical staff after hours. Her response? Block access. That's when something inside me snapped. I ran to her door and pounded like my life depended on it. Because it did. And so did my mom's. It took forever, but finally the porch light flicked on. Deborah opened the door, hair in curlers, face mask half peeled, bathrobe tied in a neat bow. "Do you have any idea what time it is?" she snapped. I pointed at the flashing lights behind me. "The ambulance can't get to our house. My mother is dying, Deborah. Move your car." She squinted at the ambulance, then crossed her arms. "This area is for residents only. No commercial vehicles without 48-hour written notice. Section 12, paragraph 8. My jaw dropped. "You're quoting bylaws? That's an ambulance." "Should have followed the rules," she shrugged. "Actions have consequences. Let me stop here and say this. Rules have a place. They protect structure, safety, and fairness when used with wisdom. But when they're weaponized, when they're enforced without empathy, they don't protect. They harm." Deborah didn't ask if my mom was okay. She didn't show concern. She saw flashing lights and thought about control, not care. And that's the line between policy and cruelty. The paramedics had to unload their gear at the street, hop a lawn, navigate flower beds, and lug a stretcher across uneven grass, while my mother's oxygen levels dropped dangerously low. One of them muttered, "We lose minutes like this, we lose people." And Deborah? She stood there on our lawn, clipboard in hand, writing up a violation report. Medical transport was not pre-approved by the board, she said, scribbling like it was just another Tuesday. That moment changed me. That's when I realized this wasn't about misunderstandings. This wasn't about community guidelines. This was about something darker. It was about someone who cared more about lawn decor and regulation numbers than a human life. And yet, in the midst of that chaos, something happened I'll never forget. As the paramedics tried to move past her, my mother, half-conscious, gray-lipped, reached into her purse and whispered, "Show them." Inside her wallet, tucked beside her ID, was a golden badge. Chief Sandra Martinez, Boston Police Department. My mother, a woman who had spent 27 years saving lives, now fighting for her own. And Deborah? She had just blocked a police chief's emergency medical care. That was the moment the story changed. Not just for me, not just for my mom, but for our entire neighborhood. Because Deborah was about to learn something she never expected. Rules can't protect you from justice. Let me show you what happened next. There's something surreal about watching your mother turn blue. It doesn't feel real. Not at first. Not when her eyes are still open. Not when her fingers are clawing for air. Not when you're holding her, whispering, "It's okay, help is coming, just hold on." But somewhere between the gasps and the machine's frantic beeping, you realize this is no longer a medical scare. This is a countdown. And 3 a.m. was the hour it all came crashing down. After our confrontation with Deborah, the ambulance finally reached the house. The paramedics wheeled the stretcher through the dewy grass, dodging sprinkler heads, carrying portable oxygen tanks as fast as they could. Inside, my mom was barely conscious. Her lips had gone from pale to a haunting bluish gray. Her breathing? Shallow, labored. Her chest rising and falling in tiny, terrified jerks. BP 170 over 100, O2 dropping. The lead paramedic, Mike, according to his name tag, placed the mask over her face and turned to me. "We need to move, now." And then came her. Deborah, but in hand, still in her bathrobe, standing right in our path with a look that said, "You may win this round, but I'm writing you up anyway. You can't remove a resident without board clearance," she snapped. Section 14 states, "Ma'am," Mike cut her off, "this is an emergency. You're obstructing care. Please, step aside." Deborah actually pulled out her phone. "I'm documenting this for our records. This ambulance was never authorized." Authorized. That word hit me like a punch to the chest. My mother didn't need authorization. She needed oxygen. She needed seconds, not signatures. And Deborah? She was still treating this like a parking violation. Here's the terrifying truth I learned that night. Red tape kills. We like to think bureaucracy is annoying, sure, but harmless. But when it's used to stall life-saving care, when it stands between a dying woman and a medical team, it becomes a weapon. Not a gun, not a knife, but a wall, a delay, a perfectly legal pause that costs someone their life. I tried to push past her, but Deborah didn't budge. She demanded to see proof of residency. She wanted to know why the medical equipment was there. She accused the paramedics of violating quiet hours. I couldn't take it anymore. "You're blocking emergency care, Deborah. Do you understand that?" Her voice didn't waver. "Do you understand you're breaking community rules?" That's when Mike stepped between us. "I need you to move, or I will call law enforcement for obstruction." That made her flinch, but not move. Not until my mother, eyes fluttering open for the briefest second, pointed to her purse. I grabbed it, still confused, and opened it. There it was. The badge. The gold-polished badge of a woman who had protected this city for 27 years. Chief Sandra Martinez. I stepped forward and held it up to the flashing lights. "Meet my mother," I said, loud enough for every neighbor awake to hear. "She's not just someone fighting to breathe. She's the chief of police, and you're standing in her way." Deborah's mouth opened, then closed again. Mike picked up his radio immediately. "Dispatch, we're transporting Chief Martinez to Boston General. Requesting police escort. We have obstruction on scene. Repeat, obstruction." That word changed everything. Within 2 minutes, the cul-de-sac lit up with blue. 3 patrol cars pulled in fast, tires screeching. Officer Jenkins, my mom's right-hand deputy for over a decade, stepped out. His face went from confusion to fury in under a second. "What the hell happened here?" he asked, already heading toward Deborah. She started her usual spin. "There was a misunderstanding. She's not registered. There are protocols." Jenkins didn't even blink. You blocked an ambulance from reaching the chief. That's felony obstruction." Her face drained of color, and for the first time, she looked scared. The ambulance doors closed behind me as I climbed in beside Mom. Her vitals were stabilizing, the mask was working, but her eyes stayed locked on mine. "Don't let her hurt anyone else," she whispered. Even in that moment, barely hanging on, she wasn't thinking of herself. She was thinking of justice, of all the people Deborah had bullied before, of all the silence. And suddenly I knew. This wasn't just about my mom anymore. It was about stopping a tyrant. And in the next 24 hours, the entire neighborhood would find out exactly who Deborah Williams really was. There are moments when a single object changes everything. For us, it was a badge, a palm-size golden emblem tucked into a leather wallet, polished by years of use, dulled only slightly by time. It didn't flash. It didn't shine. But when I held it up to the ambulance lights and said the words, "This is Chief Sandra Martinez, Boston Police Department," the world shifted. Deborah froze. The woman who had once barked at children for playing too loudly on the sidewalk, the same woman who had scolded Mr. Wilson for hanging his flag too early in the morning. She stood in silence. The smugness vanished. The clipboard trembled in her hand, because suddenly she wasn't dealing with a powerless homeowner. She was obstructing the chief of police. And not just any chief. My mother, the woman who broke every barrier in a male-dominated department. The first Latina to command a Boston district. The officer who once talked down a bank robber with nothing but her voice, now barely able to breathe in the back of a rig. As the police escort roared through the dark streets toward the hospital, I sat next to her and watched the monitors stabilize. Her hand still in mine, her eyes half open, murmuring just one thing. "They need to know." At first I thought she meant the paramedics, or the HOA board, but I realized later. She meant everyone, the entire neighborhood, the people who had stayed quiet while Deborah ruled through fear and citations. And that badge? It did more than clear a path to the ER. It shattered the silence. The next morning, Pinecrest Estates woke up to flashing lights and flashing headlines. 3 squad cars lined our cul-de-sac. Neighbors gathered in bathrobes, clutching coffee mugs, watching from behind curtains. Deborah stood on her lawn, cornered by officers, trying to explain herself. Her husband Frank looked like he hadn't slept. He tried to reason with them, his voice cracking. It was a misunderstanding, she thought. But nobody was listening, because Tom, good old Tom, had pulled up his doorbell cam footage. And there in 1080p clarity was Deborah, refusing to move, arguing with paramedics, smirking while my mom struggled to breathe. Later that day, I opened my phone and found over a dozen messages. "We're so sorry. We had no idea it was your mom. Deborah's gone too far this time." And that was the part that hit me hardest. "We didn't know it was your mom." As if it had to be a police chief for it to matter. As if you needed a badge to deserve help. Would they have cared if she were just a retired teacher? A cashier? Someone's grandma? That's the danger of silence. It doesn't always scream guilty, but it whispers permission. And Deborah? She had built an empire on that silence. She had made people believe that rules mattered more than people, that keeping their lawns neat was more important than keeping their hearts soft, that speaking out would cost them more than compliance ever would. But now, they saw what compliance had led to. They saw the cost of inaction, and it looked a lot like a woman nearly dying in her own living room. By noon, the HOA board had called for an emergency meeting. By 3 p.m., the local news vans had rolled in. By 6 p.m., my mother was stable and demanding her laptop. And by nightfall, the entire neighborhood was ready to speak. Not just for her, but for themselves. For every unfair warning, every unjust fine, every moment they swallowed their outrage. To keep the peace, all it took was one badge, and a woman too strong to stay quiet. But Deborah still had allies, still had claws, And what came next would test everything we believed about justice. Because this wasn't just about HOA rules anymore. This was about power, and the people finally taking it back. They say silence is safe, that keeping your head down is better than standing up, that if you don't get involved, trouble won't find you. For years, that belief kept Pinecrest Estates exactly how Deborah Williams wanted it, polished on the outside and rotting underneath. But on the morning after the ambulance incident, something changed. And it started with a casserole. It was 9 a.m. I had just returned from the hospital. Mom was stable, finally resting. I hadn't slept in nearly 30 hours. I stepped outside to clear my head, and there she was. Mrs. Patel, from across the street, holding a glass container wrapped in foil. She looked at me with teary eyes. "We never knew," she whispered. "Your mother, she's the chief? I'm so sorry. We should have done something sooner." Before I could even reply, Tom appeared next. Not with a casserole, but with signatures. "I've got 42 so far," he said, "and counting. We're demanding Deborah be removed immediately. Enough is enough." By noon, our driveway looked like a scene from a protest rally. Neighbors we hadn't spoken to in months showed up with baked goods, printed emails, violation letters from years past. Everyone had a story. The Lopez family? Deborah made them paint over their children's mural because it was too expressive. Mr. Weller? She fined him $300, 0 cents, for installing a grab bar in his porch for his disabled wife, said it ruined architectural integrity. Even the Johnsons, our oldest residents, both in their 80s, were banned from having their grandson visit during spring break because he wasn't an approved minor resident. Every story followed the same rhythm. A minor action, an overblown violation, shame delivered in the form of printed threats, and worst of all, silence. People thought they were the only ones, that maybe they had broken a rule, that maybe it was just them. But now, standing together, they realized it wasn't about the rules. It was about control, and they'd all been playing along. Until one woman nearly died. There's something powerful about shared truth. It spreads like wildfire, and once it starts burning, the lies don't stand a chance. That evening, the HOA's emergency meeting was packed. Not the usual 5 sleepy board members and a couple retirees complaining about hedge height. This was standing room only. Every chair filled, every wall lined. People who'd never attended a meeting in their life were suddenly ready to speak. At the front table, Deborah sat stiffly, flanked by the board attorney and her husband Frank. But she looked different. Her signature smug expression was gone. Her eyes were ringed with exhaustion. Her blouse, usually crisp, was slightly wrinkled. And for once, she wasn't holding her clipboard. Jeff Wilson, the board president, opened the meeting. His voice was shaky but determined. "We're here to address a serious concern regarding the obstruction of emergency services and the conduct of board member Deborah Williams." Before he could continue, Mrs. Patel stood up. "I saw it happen," she said. "I saw the ambulance parked in the street while Deborah stood on her lawn doing nothing." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Tom followed. "I reviewed every violation letter from the past year. Deborah issued 3 times more fines to residents who opposed her personal projects versus her friends." He held up a spreadsheet. Color-coded, meticulous. The evidence was no longer just emotional, it was undeniable. People kept standing, one by one. Voices trembling at first, then stronger. Not yelling, not cursing, just telling the truth. And truth is louder than any policy. Deborah tried to respond, mumbled something about misinterpretation and unfortunate circumstances. But it was too late. The room had already decided. This community no longer belonged to fear. That night, we didn't just challenge a board member. We reclaimed something bigger. The right to live without being watched, measured, or fined for being human. And as neighbors filed out of the meeting room, whispering and hugging and promising to never stay silent again, I looked at my mom, pale but proud, standing beside me in her full dress uniform. And I knew Deborah's reign was over. But justice? It still had one more stop to make. There was no gavel loud enough to quiet the tension in that room. The emergency HOA meeting had become something far more than procedural. It was no longer just a hearing. It was a reckoning. Deborah Williams, once the queen of Pinecrest Estates, now sat on the defensive, her kingdom crumbling beneath her. And at the center of it all stood my mother, Chief Sandra Martinez, dressed in full uniform, oxygen tube discreetly tucked into her lapel, spine straight, gaze locked on justice. Jeff Wilson cleared his throat. Before we proceed, I'd like to officially recognize Chief Martinez and thank her for her decades of public service. The room erupted in respectful applause. Deborah didn't clap. Her arms were crossed. Her lips were pressed so tightly together they nearly disappeared. But her eyes, they darted left to right, calculating. Because she knew this was the end. What she didn't know was how it would end. I was asked to speak first. I told the board everything. From the first notice on our door, to the 3 a.m. ambulance standoff, to the dozens of stories from neighbors that followed. This wasn't about enforcing the rules, I said. It was about using them as a weapon, against the elderly, the sick, the different, against anyone who pushed back. I turned to face her. You didn't just block a driveway, you blocked a life. Deborah didn't respond. She just stared through me, like I was a problem she couldn't ticket away. But then my mom stood up, and silence fell like a curtain. I've served for 27 years in law enforcement, she began. And I've seen power used wisely, and I've seen it abused. She paused, scanning the room. Last week I nearly died because someone in this community decided that rules mattered more than people. But I'm not here tonight to punish, I'm here to protect. That line hit everyone like a thunderclap. Even Deborah blinked. Mom continued, voice stronger now. This isn't just about me. It's about the next elderly neighbor. The next wheelchair ramp. The next scared parent who doesn't have a badge in their wallet. She reached into her briefcase and pulled out a folder. These are protocols from HOA communities across the country. They ensure emergency access. They prevent retaliation against medical needs. And they protect residents from being silenced by people who misuse authority. She set them on the table. I won't press charges if 2 conditions are met. Dead silence. You could hear the AC kick on. These safety protocols are implemented immediately. And 2, Mrs. Williams resigns, effective tonight. Gasps. Chairs creaked. All eyes turned to Deborah. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. Then her attorney stood up. Chief Martinez, this seems excessive for what was clearly a misunderstanding. But before he could finish, Officer Jenkins walked in. Full uniform, badge gleaming. He wasn't smiling. Actually, he said, we have sworn statements from the EMTs and camera footage from neighbors. Obstructing emergency medical services is a felony under state law. He turned toward Deborah. And attempted manslaughter charges have been filed. Pending this board's action, we will proceed with arrest. Deborah's face went ghost white. Her husband Frank reached for her hand. She pulled away. What came next was swift. Jeff Wilson turned to the board. All in favor of accepting Chief Martinez's proposal? Every hand went up, even Frank's. And just like that, the rain ended. No more threats. No more citations. No more silence. Deborah stood up slowly, gathered her things, and for the first time, she looked small. As she passed me, she paused. You'll regret this, she muttered, and met her gaze. No, you will. That night, the board voted to name the new emergency policy the Martinez Safety Initiative. A formal apology was issued to our family and the entire neighborhood. And while my mom didn't press criminal charges that night, the DA's office still had a say. But something bigger had already happened. For the first time in a long time, we felt safe. And yet, even then, I couldn't shake one question. How many more neighborhoods like ours were still living under silence? Most people walk into an HOA meeting expecting petty arguments about mailbox colors or fence height. But this time we walked out with something else, a new policy born from near tragedy. We called it the Martinez Safety Initiative. And behind every bullet point was a moment my mother almost didn't survive. The days after Deborah's resignation felt strange. Quiet. No warning letters stuffed into mailboxes. No clipboards lurking behind hedges. No more anonymous complaints about visual clutter. But something else was happening too. For the first time, neighbors were talking to each other. Not whispering, not venting, but collaborating. Tom took the lead in drafting the formal version of the Martinez Safety Initiative, with input from 3 attorneys, 2 EMTs, and my mother, who refused to take a break even from her hospital bed. She'd say, "We can't let this happen again, not here, not anywhere." So what was the Martinez Safety Initiative? It was simple, actually. Just 5 rules. But those 5 rules had the power to save lives. No HOA rule may override access to emergency services. No citations, blockages, or penalties may be issued in relation to 911 response. Residents with medical equipment or recovery needs are automatically exempt from aesthetic enforcement. Yes, even if the oxygen machine doesn't match the porch paint. No resident can be fined or cited for housing an immediate family member for temporary medical care. All HOA security cameras must be publicly declared with angles facing only shared spaces, not private. Retaliation against residents for reporting violations or emergencies will result in immediate board review and possible removal. You would think something that reasonable would already be standard. But here's the truth. Most HOA contracts in the U.S. are built with vague language and unchecked enforcement. And people rarely fight back until it's too late. Our pain became our policy. And that policy, it rippled. A week after the vote, Boston General Hospital released a statement commending the HOA's decision. 2 local news stations ran the story. And 3 other neighborhoods in our county reached out asking for copies of the initiative. By the end of the month, HOAs in neighboring states had begun implementing similar protections, some even naming them after my mom. For a woman who once thought retirement meant gardening and game nights, my mother was suddenly doing Zoom calls with city officials, attorneys, and homeowners coalitions. Her voice, calm but fierce, became the reminder people needed. Rules without humanity are just cages. But the most powerful change happened right here, on our block. Mrs. Patel's niece, who uses a mobility scooter, came to stay for 2 weeks and nobody said a word. The Johnsons finally welcomed their grandson for a long overdue visit. And one morning, Tom and I caught Deborah's husband, Frank, now single, quiet, older, planting roses along the sidewalk Mr. Wilson used to care for. He didn't say much, but he nodded. Sometimes. Change begins with a badge. Other times, with a bloom. Looking back, the Martinez Safety Initiative didn't just change policy. It changed people. We became neighbors again. Not surveillance targets. Not potential violators. Neighbors. We looked out for one another. Checked in. Showed up. All because one woman, gasping for breath, still had the strength to say, "Don't let her hurt anyone else." And we listened. But even as things settled, there was one last scene that stayed with me. A certified letter arrived one morning. HOA stamped, but different. Inside was a refund check. Every medical fine ever issued by the previous board had been nullified and repaid. 12 households. Thousands of dollars. Gone in a single vote. It wasn't just a gesture. It was closure. But justice is never just about policy. It's about what we do next. And what I did next surprised even me. Because when the new board asked for volunteers, I raised my hand. I never imagined I'd sit on an HOA board. Not after everything we'd been through. Not after the sleepless nights, the ambulance lights, the clipboard threats. Not after watching my mother turn blue while someone quoted bylaws like they were sacred scripture. But sometimes the very thing that nearly breaks you becomes the reason you stand up. 2 weeks after Deborah's resignation, I took a seat at the same table where she once ruled. It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about power. It was about presence. About making sure no one else ever had to fight this fight alone. I didn't have a law degree. I didn't know all the codes by heart. But I knew what compassion looked like. And I knew what silence could cost. And that was enough. Our first meeting under the new board felt different. No tension, no hidden agendas. Just people, ordinary neighbors, coming together to solve real problems. We talked about things that actually mattered. A broken sidewalk near the Johnsons' place. A proposal to build a shaded bench near the mailboxes for elderly residents. A plan to hold a summer block party for the first time in 10 years. And when someone asked about noise complaints and rule enforcement procedures, another neighbor smiled and said, "Let's start with kindness. The rest we can figure out." Funny how quickly a place can change when people remember they belong to each other. The kids started riding their bikes without looking over their shoulders. Mr. Wilson's vines bloomed again, freely, unapologetically, spilling over the fence like they were claiming back time. And that HOA newsletter? It no longer warned about violations. It shared recipes, birthdays, book club pics, a lost cat notice signed "with love." My mom came to one of the meetings a month later, still weak, still healing. When she entered, the room stood. Some clapped, others cried. And in a voice softer than I'd ever heard her use in uniform, she said, "I didn't survive because I wore a badge. I survived because someone used their voice when I couldn't. That's what real protection looks like." That night, a neighbor I barely knew, an introverted man named Glenn, approached me in the parking lot. He held a crumpled citation from 2 years ago. "She fined me for having wind chimes," he said, eyes down. Said they were nuisance noise. My wife had just passed away. They were hers. I kept them up because it made me feel like she was still home. I didn't know what to say, so I just listened. And he smiled for the first time I'd ever seen. "You gave people like me permission to speak." That's when it hit me. You don't have to be loud to be powerful. You don't need a badge, a title, or a clipboard. You just need to care enough to say something, even when your voice shakes. Even when you think no one will listen. Because sometimes that's all it takes. One voice. And once one speaks up, others follow. The silence breaks. The stories pour out. The fences fall. And what's left? A community. Not just people living side by side, but people living for one another. One evening, as fall crept in and the leaves turned golden, I sat on the porch with my mom. Kids played in the cul-de-sac. Someone strummed a guitar from a few houses down. The air smelled like cinnamon and new beginnings. She looked over at me, eyes soft but tired. "You fought for me before they knew who I was," she said. "That's courage most people never find." I squeezed her hand. "I learned it from you." She smiled, then looked at the quiet street that had once been a battlefield. Funny, isn't it? All it takes is one person refusing to stay silent. We sat there for a while, just breathing, just watching, just being. And somewhere deep in my heart, I knew. This story wasn't just ours anymore. It was for every community still stuck in fear. Every neighbor afraid to speak. Every voice waiting for permission. So if you're hearing this and you see a Deborah in your neighborhood, be the first to stand up. You might be surprised who stands with you. Like, share, speak up. Because the smallest voice might be the one that saves a life.